Hello everyone, today we talk about the Italo-Norman Knight for our Knighthood series slash medieval warfare, whatever. This is a topic that we actually rarely addressed in terms of times and space. We made a video, I think, on pre-Norman Southern Italy for what was concerned, in terms of the Saracen invasions, and something even about Byzantine history broadly meant, but never quite specifically about what was really southern Italy and Sicily during the 11th century. In this moment, in fact, in which the Normans that begin to appear, small groups already since the end of the 10th, rise to this incredible power that is built step by step. It didn't happen overnight, but it was very consistent and very rapid for those time standards in general. And that eventually, as you know, will establish the Siculo-Norman kingdom, the kingdom of Sicily, right, the Norman kingdom of Sicily, and achieving this astonishing result of unifying, politically speaking, this broader area, right, especially of southern peninsular Italy, that since since Roman times, actually, since the Ostrogoths, after the Gothic War, after the Longobardian invasions, had been fundamentally fragmented, right? It didn't have a unitary character. This wasn't an area in which you can say there was a Romano-Germanic kingdom established with a unity of its own. It was, as we'll see now, a very fascinating, actually, area with the overlapping of many different military cultures that all had, that are somewhat underestimated, first of all, and overlooked a bit, like the Iberian area, but also properly the central Mediterranean, Tunisia included, as we'll see today, for the development of many, even military technologies. We've seen it, we hinted at it in that video on the 13th century Spanish knight, right? Realizing how this broader southwestern Mediterranean area, let's say, had, so that is not dramatically documented for reasons now we can't digress on, but that from the hints we have, of information we have, seems to have developed not much of a unique, but more specifically a more advanced technical background, of which, once again, we don't know much. This is something I honestly discovered fairly late in time, thanks to Schwerpunkt itself, because I believed that, after all, this wasn't much of a, maybe about Spain, right, I could think it, but, I thought that it was pretty much homogeneous also to the rest, either of the Christian or the Muslim world. But objectively, there are some hits we'll see now that are very important also for future military developments. We talk about the Italo-Norman Knight in here, specifically for this, right? At some point we'll have to make a Siculo-Norman Knight video, for example. Also, at the time of the full establishment of the Kingdom of Sicily, that, as you know, was established actually in the 12th century, officially at least, that it was already consolidated by the Hauteville, but would reach that level of, that rank, that monarchical royal ranking specifically, only later. There is all a specific military tradition that stems from the Normans onwards in the Kingdom of Sicily, which surely entailed this syncresis with pre-existing military cultures, but that in a way will remain, especially considering the political institutional profile of the Siculo-Norman kingdom, quite unique, I would say, in the history of high medieval Europe, low medieval Europe, whenever you want to make it arrive. It will be very important also for the Swabian and the Angevin dominations that will arrive later, and that we can call actually as the single most centralized Latin Germanic kingdom, right, of the High Middle Ages, even more than the Kingdom of England, right? It's not a chance that this happened both in this two Norman kingdoms, as you know, that also England had this dramatic, also thanks to the Anglo-Saxon legacy, by the way, let's say, unity, administrative traditions, and so on, that by the 11th century, the time of Hastings, actually were quite advanced, right? But the Siculo-Norman kingdom is dramatically underrated in this regard, if anything, because I realize many people don't even know that it kind of even existed, right? Sometimes it happened to me to speak with people who were passionate about medieval warfare, even specifically about Norman warfare, and had never heard that. How is it that even possible? These things, I presume, if you study medieval history in school, it should be there. Just if you look at a map of, you may not know maybe the whole epopee of the Normans in the south, but I mean it's quite a big thing. Think about Bohemond of Taranto in the First Crusade, who was the most active military leader out there. There is this broader legacy that eventually the Hohenstaufen will collect. It's fairly well known, right, that the Normans established this reality, but objectively, and I can understand this, a few realize what the Normans were capable of building, specifically in Sicily, and to eventually consolidate also the rest of peninsular Italy, where they technically started from. And that's the reason why we talk about Italo-Normans today, because that's where they began from. And it doesn't end here as a set of, premises, because another overlooked point that I also wasn't completely aware up to a few time ago is the fact that, even in other videos I presented more or less I think I never stated that the Norman conquest of England and the one of Sicily were actually similar, that they were objectively very different in nature, right? You will see it better today. But still, the Norman element had some comparable aspects in both processes, let's say. The problem, though, is that this southern Italian 11th century, let's say, is still very historiographically debated. That is, we don't know, first of all, very much, because as we've said, there was no real center of power that could, somewhat absorb and collect, or also, systematically a good set of documentation and so on. So it's a very complicated area. Also for the previous centuries, and specifically in pre-Norman times, it's not easy to know what happened there, and a lot actually happened in there. There's that video I made on the Saracens that dealt actually more specifically with southern Italy, that properly the Saracen thing itself. So if you go in the medieval Islam playlist or medieval Italy playlist, you will find that. And that's fascinating because it makes you realize that also these local powers were powers properly, right? That they were small, they were also favored sometimes by the geographical location. Southern Italy, except for Apulia, is basically all mountains, right? A very few coastal plains. There is in fact a very strong divide between, culturally, historically, even linguistically, between the coast and the interland, the mountainous interland. It was a soundly urbanized region of Europe, right? There were many important, especially coastal centers. The very first Italian maritime republics actually were born in the south, right? Because initially, right at this point, especially the south was even more promising than the center in the north that eventually would develop communalism and the most famed republics, and the Normans actually have to do with having choked eventually these local autonomies by establishing a properly feudal kingdom. But the idea that somewhat, and we stressed other point, it really needs a lot of premises, because this is a somewhat undebated and obscure part of medieval Europe in a way. The same concept of the Normans, right? We think of the Normans today mostly because of Viking history, and we care at some. I personally don't much, at least I do it in what is historically correct. I mean, but in stressing, for example, the continuity between the Vikings at the time of Rollo and the settlement on the lower Seine river. At the beginning of the 10th century, as this continuity of the Norse legacy of Normandy in a way. When we talk about the Norman conquest of England, or essentially the adventurers that conquered Sicily, we're talking about something very different from that. you can say that aside from biological continuity that also wasn't prevalent, that is to say, when the Normans settled in Normandy proper, there were other people, and they were absorbed, like they were a minority eventually. So, but especially by the time, the mid 11th century, let's say, we're talking, for in any other regard, political, military, institutional, linguistical, literary, we're talking about Western Franks, right? You can't, by any standard, and I stress here, by any standard, separate the Normans, right, of Normandy, right, and the Western Franks, broadly meant. They are the same, identical thing, right? And I stress, by any standard, there is no difference of sort. The figure of the Normans naturally has fascinated because of their epopee, right? It was sang as such. Definitely there was some cultural legacy, broadly meant, in realizing also the context that the Duchy of Normandy had with the Anglo-Danish kingdom, we can say at this point more than Anglo-Saxon, before the conquest. Of the fact that objectively, even if the northern, the countries that faced the Channel, right, the North Sea, were somewhat close also in their regard, but there are much deeper divides that have to do naturally with the vassalitic beneficiary system. I presume that in the medieval Scandinavia, that is, talking specifically about the development of feudalism in the North, in northern kingdoms, we have explained pretty well, at least enough, for long enough, how long it took for Scandinavia to just develop what, in continental Europe in terms of vassalitic beneficiary relations, and eventually the feudal system from a political and institutional point of view it took, right? Those are countries that came much later, right? Especially Sweden, the most obviously there is a geographical element that plays some factor as well, and therefore the Normans that invade England, just to make you understand what we're talking about, they were also properly an institutional thing, right? There you have William, this Duke of Normandy, and with the whole army of the Dutch, and plus a lot of other guys, and this is also the point we're connecting, but also in part the Normans that from Hauteville came to southern Italy, and also a lot of the other people that joined them in a sense were as Normans, as at least from the component that came from Normandy proper at that point, Western Franks. They were Western Franks, and the more I studied this period, the more I realized that there is no difference of any sort between a Norman knight and a Western Frankish knight, because a Norman knight is a Western Frankish knight by definition. And there are some important punctualizations, though, to make. That is to say, famously enough, that the guys that invaded Anglo-Saxon England, for example, weren't just Normans from Normandy, right? They were Flemish, they were Bretons, there were people coming. They had Byzantine engineers, famously enough, that William called specifically to for the shipbuilding, all the important aspects of the expedition. So we are fairly different places of origin, in a way. Also, and even more, right? Those that we call Normans in southern Italy are something more diverse, even than that. Norman becomes a synecdoche, right? It's literally about the men of the north, which also from a southern Italian standpoint could be that, as we will see, was also a very peculiar area. Even compared to the rest of Italy, there were important differences in that regard. I don't know. The rest of Italy was part of the former, had been part of Carolingian Empire. At this point, it's the whole Roman Empire. It theoretically includes, it's included in this broader Frankish area, right? In terms of political and social characters, in spite of a greater urbanization. But essentially, for example, the vassalitic beneficiary system is there. In the south, we'll see that there were important differences. They're not so enormous in the sense that by the 11th century, and this is what we stress all the time when we make this kind of videos specifying this specifically Italo-Norman Knight of the 11th century, but it was way more homogeneous than we think. To make long story short, these Normans came from very different areas, right? They could be Normans, Bretons, Flemish, but it could even be other Italians, Germans, people that specifically for when the Normans hegemonized, let's say, the southern Italy and eventually take over Sicily as well, are mostly also coming from the subjected communities of southern Italy as such. As we will see, also during the Norman conquest of Sicily, there were lots of Muslims that actually were integrated into the Norman army, and that remained an important feature actually even in the more consolidated Norman kingdom that would rise from Sicily specifically, that will become, as you know, the center proper of this kingdom that stretched up to the in central Italy at some point, and therefore encompassing an area that becomes that reality so much that the Western Franks and the Eastern Franks, the French, the Germans, especially in this moment in which the Europeans go all together to the Crusades, and definitely the Siculo-Normans had a very privileged place in here, because not only they were in this splendid Mediterranean location that allowed them to reach quite quickly to threaten the Byzantine Empire, for example, that they invaded multiple times, and now we'll see how important that connection also was, but it established the Principality of Antioch, right, that lived in this broader Mediterranean reality, actually discriminated against the same southern, the southern Normans, let's say, because they called them poulains, bastards, because they felt they had somewhat, synchronized in this broader, let's say, borderline Christian area, also dwelling among Muslims, right? Most Muslims actually living in Sicily were actually abandoned the island at the time of the Norman conquest. Other remained and were gradually converted. Other Muslims actually remained as such, right? Famously enough, also think about the bodyguards of Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, and in the 13th century still the military colony of Lucera in southern Italy. There's this continuity, but they were seen as something a bit, outside of what the canonic Frankish area mostly had in Central Europe was about. There will be so much to tell about just this last aspect that is embarrassing to cut in here, but we will talk about the Kingdom of Sicily in another occasion. We made a couple of videos, we explained a bit what it was, but given the broader importance, we will have to catch up with lots of other videos. There's another element too that we partially hinted at, that is the Byzantine presence in southern Italy. Right up to this point, basically we'll see it better later, but as you know, the certain areas, especially of Calabria and Apulia, were being reconquered by the Byzantines. Right, we often think, in fact, of the Normans that conquered southern Italy, taken away from the Muslims, but actually the Byzantines had undergone, especially since the late 8th, the 9th century, this important process of reconquest of peninsular Italy, after having lost actually Sicily to the Muslims, for example. That naturally caused a broader international problem that also favored the rise of the Normans in these places, because southern Italy had always remained from that point onwards specifically, but also from previous years, especially before the Saracen age, this borderline area between the Western and the Eastern Empire, right? The Franks from one side, the Byzantines from the other, and naturally the papacy also pretty close. So the Norman affirmations in these areas has to do partially with this political reality. The Holy Roman Empire actually initially backed the rise of the Normans in anti-Byzantine function. They had a great thing to actually earn from it. Then eventually there were problems with the papacy. Famously, the Battle of Civitate, the same pope was captured. As you know, that was eventually from that conflict. It's what will create the the marriage between the Normans and the Roman Church, so much that the Siculo-Norman kingdom was, since the very beginning, a papal vassal, right? And this polity also throughout the centuries will remain dramatically close to Rome, to the papacy, in a very obsequious fashion, we can say. For what the Normans and Mediterranean relation is concerned, is that we know that here we're not just talking about this western route, but also the eastern one. We made recently a video on, like 1 month ago, about the Varangian Guard, right, and its natural Norse origin, that however at some point came to be also mitigated in that regard, because that was a synecdoche as well. There were also lots of properly also Slavic elements, or eventually many Norse were also settled. There were many Anglo-Saxons as well. It's from this point onwards, by the way, consider that when the Normans invaded the Byzantine Empire, there were lots of Anglo-Saxon refugees from the Norman invasion of England. They had fled there and that fought against the Normans in that context. There is a beautiful history, and as we have seen many times, the Westerners, Normans included, but not only them, by the way, had been touring around the Mediterranean for quite a while as contractors, right, as military, as mercenaries fundamentally. The same Normans in southern Italy actually begin as contractors, as private contractors for the pilgrims that they wanted to arrive in the south of Italy at the Apulian Sanctuary St. Michael Archangel, from there to embark to the Holy Land. This process also with the Seljuk conquest of Jerusalem had brought, contrarily to what is felt, actually through our reinforcement of the military protection of the pilgrims in the Near East, there's a very fluid dimension in this regard. And there is actually no surprise that in such a deeply fragmented area of Europe, where warfare was so dynamic, was so ongoing all the time, the Normans, as they were practically everywhere, would start doing their own business in a way. Whereas with the local, think about the Byzantine Empire, main power, that's something that they tried to do at the beginning, but they eventually saw better not to stop, and on the contrary to ally with the empire and to go serving in it. But it's way more complex than it seems, because naturally even the Normans, in southern Italy, as we have seen, will become actually the most threatening enemy of the Byzantine Empire, right? The Seljuks are a joke to the Byzantines compared to the Normans, right? The Seljuks, take out Asia Minor, but they don't come to threaten the same Constantinople on multiple occasions. They don't sack Thessalonica, the second city of the empire. They're not this threatening thing. They after Manzikert, they fundamentally stop, right, and fragment. The Normans are ever more powerful. By the 12th century, this by far one of the single most powerful kingdoms in Europe, and it's constantly this thorn in the side, this constant threat, can attack Greece, Epirus, Thessaly, and even come to threaten Constantinople. Think about all the Siculo-Normans that were with Bohemond of Taranto under the walls of Constantinople, and how the Byzantines were triggered by that. There is also a beautiful literature, chiefly from Anna Komnena, that describes the Normans, what she calls the Celts by classical elitism, that has actually nothing to do with practical reality, in the sense that it's a synecdoche even in there, because of course these guys came from France, but also it was more a way of fighting at a certain type of people, generally speaking, that came out of this Frankish feudalism, that are basically the Western Frankish originated knights that arrived in these circumstances in the East as basically the best cavalrymen out there, right? And that's absolutely true, because Western Francia at this point was the cradle of of Western chivalry in this regard, and will expand basically all over, right? And it's actually come to influence already by the 11th century certain areas of southern Italy. Now we should make we made a video on, if I'm not wrong, the southern Longobards, the Langobardia Minor, right? So these principalities we'll see in a while that had survived the Frankish conquest of the Longobard kingdom in the north, and at had retained this kind of ethnic in their political, juridical tradition, institutionally, administratively speaking. They were Longobards, but they had, in many ways, just like you could see in other cultures, like even the Byzantine one, like think about the Paranoia this time. I'm sure this is to be found even in the Caliphate of Cordoba that is fragmentating in the various taifas. I mean, this brought properly feudalization of the high medieval world, right? So there are, once again, a lot of prejudices and also objectively lots of things we don't know properly about this world, but from the hints we get realities are extremely fascinating. And in the case of the Normans, seem to have been determinant even for their expansion in the south. Right, it's been actually said that politically speaking, because we will see now that the Normans that arrived in southern Italy were just bands of mortars. Like, it's not that they had, what I was saying before, like William the Conqueror, an army, right? Or there were people that came. There were a bunch of guys. There were a few families, right? It was plenty of other mercenaries technically somewhere else, right? So, or in the same places, right? So. The point here naturally should be all read, and we can't do it today because today we're technically talking about just the Italo-Norman knight as a knight, as its equipment, its mindset, its the way they fought, etc. But it's obvious that the rise of the Normans must be a bit rewritten in this area, mostly highlighting the decisive role that the same local communities had in actually supporting the same rise, right? And also the broader international policy that involved the Holy Roman Empire, the papacy, right? That actually favored this situation and took this enormous opportunity. I think one of the very first videos I made on Schwerpunkt was, it was pretty lame, as usually, especially the first ones are. And the point was there to realize this enormous victory of the papacy in this whole. I mean, the fact that the papacy created, right, it's not that they didn't have problems. At a point, the Normans will even arrive to sack Rome, they will make a mess and so on, but that's also for other political reasons. But generally speaking, they had this friendly vassal power that remained under properly papal control for an enormous time, and that, swept the central Mediterranean definitely from the Saracen presence. For the rest at sea, at least, mostly the Pisa and Genoa would do, and had already done by this time, because that's what the Muslims were substantially weakened in the central Mediterranean already, and during this period. But that is to say, it's not that the Normans rose specifically in anti-Muslim function. This is very important to stress too, and generally speaking. So the compaction, as we were saying at the beginning, of this important region of Europe under a sole ruler, with the single most centralized kingdom in Latin Germanic Europe of the time. So you understand a complete change also, aside from papal policy, but of the world balance in the Mediterranean. Like, just for Byzantine history, this is dramatic, right? The Byzantines will always be fundamentally enemies with whoever stayed here, where and another. This would happen also with the Swabians. It would happen with the Angevins, because the most obvious rule was to conquer Constantinople from there, right? That wouldn't be carried out by the Sicilians, as you know. It would be carried out by the Venetians and the French during the Fourth Crusade. But it's still part of the wolf picture is still part of this wolf Frankization, let's say, of Western Europe, and of its broader consolidation, right? The export of its military model. This is of extreme importance, in my opinion. So the south of Italy and Sicily were politically and, to some extent, culturally separated from the rest of the peninsula, right? They, at least under this period, and for a time to come, relatively, still even in modern times, Italy is politically and socially, at least, especially in socio-economical standards, divided. There is a central northern Italy, some of the most productive areas in Europe. The south lowers the average. This is a process that been largely debated in Italian historiography, but has naturally to do in many ways with the establishment of the southern kingdom. It eventually, went its own way for most of medieval and modern times. The kingdom of Sicily was one of the first powers in Europe, right? They had an enormous wealth, especially agricultural resources. They had this trade capability. Even all the history that this thing began its long decline since the time of the Vespers, being completely resized as a thing. Mostly its decline, it has to do with it starts in a way, at least the preconditions from the late Swabian time, and it is true. But up to the 18th century, its standards were very high. It's just that from the 19th, especially the control of the area, for the relation of the state with the local communities went downhill. The power of the nobility also prevented further reforms. I mean, it was a very complicated. It's actually a very complicated topic, but it began, right. The separation of these two areas of the peninsula began in exactly with the establishment of this thing that was absolutely non-existent before. I mean, the reality of this kingdom didn't exist. The Norman kingdom wasn't part, for example, of the Holy Roman Empire. There was nothing before that had made Southern Italy. Southern Italy historically had never been a unique entity. Never, right? It begins with this kingdom proper. So it's all the more important in this perspective, and there is objectively a divide that is born out here. Communal Italy, that we mostly know. We made a lot of videos about that to explain, the important development, from which also the humanism and the Renaissance would emerge, is all connected to this decentralized position that central northern Italy had, that will confer certain specific characters, the emergence and development of the city-states, eventually to regional states, and pretty advanced forms up to very 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 late in the modern age. The South instead was actually going alongside the same pattern, or it was even more advantaged, telling the truth, because it was overall, even a more urbanized actually area, very well placed, as we've seen. Trade routes of the Mediterranean between Europe and the rest of the world. It was very florid agricultural area. Sicily exported grain for all over. Like in Europe, most of Italian cities, also of the north, would actually be maintained with Sicilian grain. That's what the great banking fortune of Florence would begin like, for example, since that they subcontracted in Angevin times all these lands after the crusade against Manfred of Hohenstaufen. And the Normans come to cut that, right? The cities continue to exist. They're also pretty large, but they are increasingly hegemonized by baronial power over the centuries. They become mostly agricultural centers. Also, they made being specialized manufacturers, but this whole system remains very somewhat repressive compared to what was happening in the north, where basically these communities were growing and unrestricted. And the Germans tried, as you know, to do the same in the north. They didn't manage that. There was no way at some levels. And at the same time, the capacity of these kingdoms will flow, of these lands will flow into supporting this pretty, as we've seen, also strategically aggressive kingdom, right? There is also broader criticism about how the kingdom was handled after the Normans, as if the Normans were the great enlightened government, and the Swabians or the Angevins were a bunch of idiots who just wanted to squeeze the land. Especially after, there will be a lot to tell, because there is also positive prejudice about the Swabians in there, which I love. As you know, I'm a Ghibelline by vocation. I love the Hohenstaufen, but objectively, especially after the death of Henry VI and stuff, and this world had been messed up, things started to go downhill, right? And also Frederick II's times weren't so enormously happy or bright as we can, and also because they were very hard times, and in spite of him, that was actually a truly enlightened ruler. So what I would like to stress here is the complexity of the background as much as possible, and the fact that there is so much just from the idea of an Italo-Norman knight that we can understand about this world, right? Sicily remained under Islamic rule. I will see better later how also the success in part of the Normans in this area, given that even Sicily was fragmented within its own Islamic rule, right? The Norman conquest of Sicily actually took a good time, took decades. It was a complicated process, if anything, just because of the nature of the land, right? Especially the interland castles were pretty damn, difficult to store. It were difficult to control after even their conquest and so on. So it took time, and we see in there that definitely this enormously just purely knightly culture wasn't the whole thing, right? Another big historiographical topic about this is, how much the Normans, that eventually, with establishment of the kingdom, began to sing their deeds in in terms of the French epics, all this stuff, etc. Naturally were soaked into feudal culture that established in a way, not since the very beginning, because if you look how the Normans eventually subjugated all these communities, they did it with pre-existing forms of pact, was all a negotiation and so on. But it's obvious that there was, and we know that, and still it's the 11th century, right? So chivalry has not reached its apex. Feudalism hasn't. That will happen just in 200 years. So the importance of infantry was probably much greater than we think, right? And in these areas there were also good light medieval infantries by those time standards in areas that had been unstable and difficult to control exactly for this reason, right? For this continuous skirmishing attacks over the mountains, etc. You understand, with all castles all around, the Normans actually carried out this massive process of encapsulation all over the newly conquered territories, but already before there were important centers. So it wasn't just a knight on horseback, right? And objectively, for whoever knows even just banally Norman history, the Norman conquest of England, later times, knows that it wasn't just all about mounted warfare, that certain knights routinely dismounted to fight, for example. And it's pretty easy, actually, to find, even in Norman warfare. We'll have to make videos, naturally, for every single medieval battle in this context, for the Siculo-Normans too. So it's we will have to do it. Now we can't speak of it, but just for telling you that it was not just the stereotypically now fully developed Western Frankish tactic at its apex, right? It was still something in process, right? Cavalry was recognized naturally as this main force in characterizing the Normans. The Franks broadly meant. Also look at the Byzantines that admitted that basically these guys were better horsemen and even more blindly courageous, right? Than they were, also in a non-completely sane way, right? Because that's what the Byzantines thought. There are striking continuities between the Pseudo Mauritius Strategicon and even just what Anna Komnena writes about these peoples, right? The cliche is always there that these guys were fanatically courageous. They actually, in the 6th century, the Byzantines didn't think much of the riding, the equestrian capabilities of the Germans. They appreciated more their infantry, but they recognized that on horseback also they were fanatically courageous, right? In a way that was even, in fact, putting them in senseless danger, right? There's always this idea of the concentration on the charge en masse, even not with so much order. Naturally, by the 11th century, things have changed, and indeed, the Normans were pretty damn good horsemen. That's something that in Normandy they specifically learned. Already the Norse were actually, surely not ignorant in horse riding, as we pretty well know, but of course there is no comparison between their collective training and the ones of the Western Franks. So actually in Normandy they get this pretty damn good political and social structures from Western Francia that naturally implemented given the distribution ratios of the land, an enormous wealth in the hands of very few people. This capability of, first of all, professionalism of the individual, but also as a social class, broadly meant as military class, the capacity of these guys to train in ever larger units, right, and to therefore increase their collective training. Also, the Bretons in the West were actually pretty good cavalrymen, especially from an individual point of view. They had also been largely influenced by the Franks at that point, so that's also where they properly learned to horse ride like crazy, right? And this equestrian culture is to be felt dramatically among the Normans. The only problem is that, as we were saying before, the Norman bands that appear in southern Italy originally as mercenaries, as guards, as escorts, they eventually increase, right? Especially after the conquest of Sicily, there will be, a mass of properly Normans that will come from northern France. We're talking about not just knights, but also the clerks, administrators, all the people that were needed to establish a new government, a new bureaucracy that in Sicily worked pretty damn well for those time standards. And but at the beginning, we're talking about a bunch of adventurers. I mean, it's not that these people were specifically, all people with previously they had land. Also the matter of titles at this point is very, very informal still in the same Western Frankish kingdom. So we're talking about initially small bodies of troops that honestly, and this is what I can quote, Calendon, that we have, even Nicole, there's plenty of authors from all sides that recognize that objectively these people, these initial groups, had, even in strictly military terms, nothing that distinguished them in a very special sense in terms of military skills or other tactical superiority of sort to the others, right? There wasn't even here. There is this prejudice that the Longobards in the south had somewhat poor cavalry or this, but there is no evidence of that. If you pick the typical local Longobard cavalry, it doesn't at this time from the documentary archaeological evidence that we have it's virtually identical to a Western Frankish, a Breton, or even in fact a Norman knight, right? The point that it's been all explained with this aggressiveness, this motivation of getting new land, of fulfilling this great project that objectively certain specific, think about Reinulf Drangot, or in fact the other eventually the Wiscard. I mean, they were very good leaders, were very intelligent. First of all, were motivated, very capable, absolutely driven. So high moral resources. Lucky as well, because that is important as well, but truly very resourceful, and especially very, very capable of dealing with the local communities, right? Realizing, for example, that Byzantine Apulia was rebelling to the empire, and without the support of those communities, for example, it would have been difficult for the Normans to take over. The same goes in a way to the first, bosses of the Normans, those that gave them the job properly as mercenaries, and they were these Longobard princes that were recurring to mercenary troops ever more increasingly, right? So these guys were in parts no ones, right? And that's a pretty good motivating factor to, especially compared to the locals, right? To actually rise and to do it with what they knew how to do pretty well, that was fighting. Right, and growing though in the process, because the Normans of the early 11th century in southern Italy are not the Normans of the 12th century, right? There is an abyss, there is a divide. the first are a bunch of monarchies. The second are feudal troops of a feudal kingdom, right? So it's very important. And two, secondly, other point, the military service, what will become also the Norman army in the future, will be made mostly of this southern Italian and Sicilian, at this point, vassals or whatever the relations had been, instituted with them, established with them, rather than this early thing of the Normans. So this was not properly even an invasion in the classical sense, right? England was properly invaded by an army and conquered and restructured in that sense from that specific leadership. What happened in Southern Italy is still somewhat very obscure. It must be properly reassessed, not in the sense of the epopee of the conquerors come from nowhere, but actually very clever mercenaries that knew how to rise to the top. And for example, medieval Russia, that's also how it began. Before we thought, the Vikings came and took over Russia. Well, today we know that it wasn't like that. Today we know it was essentially a Slavic thing through these mercenaries that eventually mixed with the local dynasties came to rule in that sense. But there are lots of other examples, historically speaking, of the very same process in which the mercenary comes. But the mercenary comes because there is usually money there going on, right? It's not that here there was a desert. These guys came and created the cavalryman, right? It didn't happen like that. But still, there are prejudices to surpass relatively to, naturally, what we want to think these guys were. Because that's, at the end of the day, what most people look at history like, and that's in fact not history. That's just presuming that, I don't know, by why people, for example, are obsessed with their own ancestors so much, as if that made something that made a difference from who they are in the present, right? If you are a failure in the present, it's not your ancestors that will give you any form of reputation, and also let's be honest about the cruelty, let's say, broadly speaking, of these realities, right? I would say the conquest of southern Italy was brutal as any conquest could be, but as we've seen, it was participated by the local communities in many ways. Took the Anglo-Saxon conquest of England, but that was brutal. That was really brutal. I mean, we know that for example, the Anglo-Saxons didn't accept it. They kept rebelling for decades. They were cut to pieces, right? Even in there was a negotiation in a while, but in a sense, but that was the really pretty brutal hammer that smashed any kind of resistance. It went pretty heavily handed on the thing. Here, the thing was very much more gradual, and this also helps to explain how the same Normans coped with these communities and managed to create something also so functional in a way that is evidently also possible thanks to those who built this together with them. This is a brutal synthesis. It lasted almost 1 hour, but this is at least the ABC of what you must know if you want to approach this topic, because it's that complicated, right? In a way, the Norman conquest of England is dramatically easier, right? In here, properly, it's way more complicated to even just understand what happened, because we don't have the same evidence, we don't have the same documentation. It's somewhat complicated, and it also takes banally, right? In order to study this thing, you should know at least Latin, Arab, Greek, naturally, most continental European current languages, at least French and Italian, and there are a few people who have this competence, Jewish as well, in part because these were important communities too there. So, and it's in the center of Mediterranean, so we can't get information from a huge variety of sources, right? That a bit as Anglo-Saxon England in the north, but in a less culturally homogeneous reality in this geographical location. And plus, just to get over certain prejudices overall that we have towards what was positive or what was negative, that is not specifically important even from a moral point of view, but just trying to understand what the hell happened, right? So we will also have to make some videos about, for example, the specifically, Sicilian Islamic and Italian Byzantine troops and administrative forms in these areas, because those are objectively other worlds in a way. There's not this huge divide, but as we were saying before, they were actually similar, right? But as I was saying before, the Byzantines had reconquered much of coastal southern Italy. That's where the coasts, historically speaking, since the time of Hellenic colonization of southern Italy, their presence was the coast and a very few tens of kilometers inland. The inland was this reality that was specifically Italic, at this point Romance, as you understand, and it was the one of the mountain, right, of the Apennines that arrived to the Strait of Messina. And this completely different reality. I mean, the Longobards duchies were specifically Germanic, politically, juridically, they were completely different, right? They were not the empire. They'd never been brought together under some other rule, by the way. It is true, by the way, that there was a strong Roman influence also in the Longobard duchies, and this is absolutely true also because exactly those ones seemingly had been established by the same Byzantines after the Gothic War with the Longobard mercenaries that had participated to contribute to defeat the Ostrogoths, that were settled there apparently even before the Longobards from Pannonia, from the Balaton, would actually march into Italy in the north, the greater invasion. So it's complex even in this regard. There were important differences, in fact, between the two areas, but still, contrarily to popular myth, also the southern Longobards felt pretty much okay with being part of the Longobard kingdom, right? It's a myth that the Longobard kingdom was all split, that it was the dramatic difference. There's no any proof of this. These were autonomous, but not, disapproving or contesting the royal kingship, the northern kingship of Pavia. There was nothing of this, and especially in these last duchies of because actually the only true rebellious duchy was the one of Spoleto. Now it was included actually in the Holy Roman Empire, right? It was close to this, but still also very different, actually, in terms of identity and balance of power. So we will cover those different areas in another time. So naturally, if you study eventually the military of the Siculo-Norman kingdom, you have to take into consideration these realities as well, that are now, however, part of the kingdom. And this was kind of normal by medieval standards, so that a kingdom was a kingdom, but it was no homogeneous reality anywhere, right? Every community was something on its own. The kingship was just created to protect the rights of these communities, right? In every other place in there. Very importantly, there are these differences, but also, let's say, relics of the various, for example, Byzantine principalities that had autonomized themselves in centuries since the empire, that will take a lot of time, actually up to in the 12th century sometimes, to conquer, right? This included the most famed, like Gaeta, Naples, Amalfi, right? In other centers, for example, Benevent was never included in. That was, as you know, the most important Longobard center at some point. At this point, had somewhat declined, but it was never incorporated by the Normans because the Beneventans handed themselves over the papacy, and that would remain papal states forever, up to the Italian unification. So there are these important divides that should be considered that are properly of different worlds, right? A mountain, a valley can make an enormous difference culturally speaking. Amalfi took ages before conquering it because the only access to it via land was through an excruciatingly difficult pass to cross. It was very easily defended, right? And also the Normans, this is also important, like these are, kind of maritime republics. The Normans instead weren't, they of course went by sea, but they didn't properly have like this enormous maritime capability on their own, right? This was typical of basically all the kingdoms in Europe out there. They didn't have enough, even just money to do that. So they over the centuries they began chiefly to rely on the maritime republics, ships, right? But that's wholly another story. But this is just for saying how even the support of the cities as communities, just think about as shipbuilders, and so it was important. Also for the conquest of Sicily, for fighting against the Byzantine invasion in the 12th century. The Normans didn't start with that, right? And they will have difficulties, even politically speaking. If you think, for example, the Battle of Dyrrhachium, by the time the Normans had the siege of Dyrrhachium, they had pretty good engineering capabilities. They created this enormous siege tower, was taller than Dyrrhachium's walls itself, and could contain up to 500 fighters. Well, the Byzantines burned down with liquid fire, right? But those are the Byzantines, you would say, but it's still a pretty amazing capability. But at the beginning, they have to rely chiefly, they don't have a state yet, so they have to rely on all these various communities that will remain, in fact, as the main. It's not that the Normans will choke them ever completely as feudal lords. They will actually be very good at playing this balance between the barons, the landlords, and the cities that were, allowing them to maintain also that political and administrative efficiency that we were talking about before. A word about the Longobards duchies that we'll see now is crucial, because as we will see, it's not that they differ dramatically from in military culture, even from what the Normans seem to have fought like, or been armed with, right? We were saying it before. They had their own distinctive military system in a way. They were archaic. They went back to even German, to Byzantine, early medieval Germanic, or even late Roman prototypes, in a sense. But this is a bit the idea we have, because somewhat we have. These systems are better documented for previous centuries, maybe not at this point. We know that things had started changing a lot, and not in a good sense for the public order of these centers, because these Longobard, there was actually the Beneventan Duchy at one point, and eventually split in three with Salerno and Capua. So that centralistic rule that in the Beneventan Duchy at the time before the Carolingian conquest of the kingdom, was pretty good, pretty united. At this point, was broken, but it spreads even in here, as we were saying before, that kind of seigneurial model that will increase the importance of cavalry. Right, that the Longobards are credited at the time of the migration here having very good cavalry, but when they settled down, they sedentarized, they somewhat lost that. Right. So it seems now towards the 11th century, for that process of feudalization of Europe and the Mediterranean, these areas too were, however, coming back, alongside even the Frankish model, orientatively speaking, to increase their cavalry capabilities. Right, and there is this prejudice that by this point the Longobards were weak in cavalry, which is probably not even. It's not really. There's no evidence for it. Right, it's not that they had excellent cavalry, but it wasn't bad, or it seemingly, given the evidence we have, was identical, at least by equipment, to the Norman one at this point. So it's an oversimplification that also stems from certain other prejudices that now we don't have the time to with this highlighting the sharp contrast between the Franks and the Longobards, that especially at this time, from this broader extension, especially the Frankish influence over even the Longobards duchies, as we've seen, didn't quite exist. Also, as it would happen in communal Italy, and as we've seen in other videos, also the southern Italian cities, such as Naples and Bari, that were of also Byzantine origin. Bari would fall in the same year of the Battle of Manzikert, by the way, and that also dramatically that explains you also why the Byzantines were in trouble, why the Normans were completing the conquest also of the main center of Apulia in that regard. So from the other side, so there was a lot of connection in all this. You find Norman mercenaries in the Byzantine army of Manzikert, as we have seen in the battle in the video about the Battle of Manzikert as well. So just let's widen our horizons in this regard. These cities had their own class of milites, just like the guys in the north. And these were urban knights, or better, they were simply knights, because at this point I don't think there is any specific study or research that has ever dealt with demonstrating an alleged difference in, individual or collective training between a knight, medieval Europe, that lives in a city or that lives in the countryside. They basically had the same kind of lifestyle, and there is no proof, right, of this. It could be increased with the, usually Western Frankish cavalry was considered the flower of Christian cavalry by all standards, by all means, and this is true. But this has to do with how much land they actually owned, right? And those guys who lived in the cities owned land too. So the divides are, just to make an example, at this time, especially by the 11th century, as the Battle of Civitate, for example, shows, nor the Germans nor the Italians that had been part of the Frankish Empire had developed such an advanced cavalry like the one you can find in the West. You start finding in Western Frankish Kingdom, right? They were technically the same thing. It's just they had a society in which wealth was much more equally distributed, and therefore also infantry was more important, for example. So these are very important changes, but it's not that a German or an Italian knight at this point were different in terms of individually and even collectively, because also they fought with other knights, right? It's not that even in France, there were these armies of thousands of troops fighting together. No, it's just that they had to struggle in a reality in which cavalry, in the sense, had in relative terms a lower weight, but individually they were the same guys, right? They stand from the same background in this regard. And I talk about the Battle of Civitate because famously the German mercenaries there fought against the Normans quite bitterly on foot, with 1.5 swords that you technically can also use on horseback, but not so well. But that anyhow lost, as you know, against Norman cavalry. But it was a pretty hardly fought victory for the Normans, and also politically, but a very important one. Also, as we were saying before, actually Apulia, that would become very important for the Normans, right? Because that's the only flatland. Apulia is like a plateau, right? And traditionally, cavalry had an important role in there since ancient times. Think about these Italic, but also Illyrian tribes that settled there. They had pretty good cavalry. In those areas, and the Normans in fact settled there. The hardcore Norman lands in this regard will be Sicily and Apulia, specifically for this reason, because they were more apt to feudalism in a sense. The Apennine hinterland, naturally it's different, right? In there, they are dramatic areas, right? Ask the Allies during World War II. Those are areas where you can entrench and put up a resistance that never ends. So it's not a surprise. It's exactly. Also, the Apulians will rebel at some point because they were actually from the other side of the kingdoms. They're also close to Byzantine interference. By the 12th century, the Siculo-Normans risked to be literally wiped out, and the Byzantines reconquer literally the whole kingdom, including. Maybe not including Sicily, but all the peninsular territories. But there were certain communities with which they just had to accept to coexist in a way, because they couldn't do much just to storm their strongholds, or at least they managed to do that with great effort. This happened especially during the civil wars between the Normans during the chiefly the first half of the 12th century. We'll have to deal with them at some point as well. So I can tell you I'm no expert about this period at all, right? I've never studied thoroughly this reality. But these, as far as I understood, checking the kind of bit of the most updated historiography on it, which in a way sucks because I don't think there is a generalized systematic interest, and especially from a strictly military point of view. It's very guessing by people who are historians, maybe even good historians, but they don't understand necessarily much about military history. So I found actually diametrically opposed opinions regarding to the reasons of the success of the Normans, right? And this means there's still something to write about. I don't know, maybe after my PhD I could concentrate. No, probably not, I will not. But it's a way open for anyone who wants to try. It's actually fascinating, and you can, with some linguistical competence, actually, it's not also this overwhelming amount of sources. A good PhD in it would be fine. Then there is also this other chunk of the story that is somewhat overlooked. That is naturally the Islamic military influence over all these territories. Right? Talking about Sicily, North Africa, where many earlier Arab or Arabicized Berbers, fundamental invaders and mercenaries had settled in. Right? There were also large contingents from some point from even Black Africa settled in Sicily by the Aghlabis. All this. There was this pretty composite reaction. We find influence from the Middle East as well. We find. It's plain. This is a very important crossroad. We were looking at, especially from Muslim Spain. That is this most fascinating cauldron of. You find even Persian influences in military gear in Spain. It's astonishing. It's beautiful, and they were dramatically advanced from a military point of view. The Central Mediterranean, as far as Tunisia was concerned, and Sicily was concerned, it was kind of a weak area of Islam. Right, the main powers were Spain and Egypt. Right, and of course the Fatimids, the rule on Egypt, namely extended control on Sicily, but at that point it was properly, Sicily had even detached itself from the originally Tunisian power that had conquered it. So. And we'll see it better later when talking specifically about some of the best iconographic evidence that we have about what we think could be a Norman knight, that as far as we know could have been easily even a Muslim one in terms of equipment. Because how do you think a Sicilian, let's say a pre-Norman Sicilian knight would be? Do you think it was actually different, like that the Muslims fought equipped in a way and the Christians fought equipped in another? They were equipped in the same way. The evidence in here is extremely fascinating because you don't practically have any means to distinguish them. Right? And you see also how dramatically influential, naturally, the northern Frankish culture was in these areas. Right? How permeable they were, but how much there is also from the outer world, and this all was mixed. So it's very beautiful in terms of especially armament, weapons, and so on. We could go on. Just think about all the Byzantine teams of Italy at this point were, as we've seen, rebellious to Constantinople, and most of the troops that arrived to fight in Italy came from other places of the empire. There were even Russians. For example, it was the famous Battle of Cannae of 1014 or 18, I don't remember. But we don't have evidence of Russians from there, Thracians, people from Asia Minor, Slavs, lots of Slavs, by the way, as well. So it's that messed up, right? And you can imagine the enormous amount of military influences coming from all of these various peoples. We even have evidence of for example, the Normans at the Iraqi fought against Seljuk mercenaries in the Byzantine army as well, right? This has to do with the whole thing of the equipment. Other two aspects that are very important that are often said in here. There is this distinctive idea of what the Norman cavalry could be, and from one of them we get the thing of the couché lance grip, right, in the charge, that is considered in the history of the evolution of Western feudal cavalry. The idea that at some point this grip prevailed. This is tendentially correct. as an opinion, in the sense that we see that overwhelmingly. And the 11th century is definitely still a moment in which you actually find, like you can see in the Bayeux tapestry or any other source of the time, mostly also, overarm, underarm, legs, grip, right? So it was totally normal. At this time, also the same heavy cavalry, in part the same knights, the same William the Conqueror, right, might have had this lances slash javelins to just harass this enemy shield walls, like at Hastings, before trying to break through, right? And so it was a time in which feudal cavalry, or what it was, also feudal is a big word for this time, because it wasn't like feudalism was still not formalized as such, right? But it was definitely heading that way. But it's still, this cavalry was still not the most devastating one. Starts being from chiefly the second half of the 12th to the 13th century, right? It was fully functionalized, fully framed in this increasing level of discipline and coordination and control from the above, from the king, that will orient itself functionally almost exclusively, at least for what combat, mounted combat was concerned, especially in pitched battles, to smashing through enemy lines with a charge, right? That entailed no other functionalization, because that was already a pretty enormously difficult and demanding tactic to perform. Just the professionalism of a feudal knight can afford, right? And for which these guys trained for a lifetime. We know, of course, the Normans at this time being already bred on horseback in a way. There was a saying said that if by 12 years old among them that you hadn't ridden a horse, you were not for war, right? You would have been a clergyman. We know these were excellent individual cavalrymen. The process that would surely, William the Conqueror's knights were pretty well, collectively trained. Just as we were saying before, the Normans that began in southern Italy weren't just, the same institutional reality, right? They came sometimes from also different backgrounds. So in a way, they were also learning along the way, and especially they needed resources, because all this cavalry attack, this specific tactic must be performed also with an enormous amount of resources, right? Of course, the local hires could pay them enough to be functional in that sense, as would happen later. But we're talking still about the 11th century. The sources are not so dramatically employable, so or even available for that matter, so we have to think of a much more individualistic way also of conceiving warfare, right, at some levels, and in these areas especially. And of course, then we know that Norman tactics, especially the more that this thing went on, and the more the Normans gathered numbers and masses under their control, were excellent, were perfect for those time standards. They had this incredible smashing power. Anna Komnene wrote that they, if they hadn't been stopped, they would have charged up to the walls of Babylon, right up to into Mesopotamia, to passing through this various Turks in the middle. And that was a reality, but we perfectly understand that it wasn't also like it was in theory, right? It was improving over time, over the centuries, right? And we're talking about, and Nakamnena writes from the late 11th, the beginning of the 12th, right, century. So if you talk about the Normans of the end of the 10th, beginning of the 11th century, the first time they appeared in Italy, namely, because they might have been there, like individually, of course, since even before, right? The Vikings had struck even in Italy, in places like Luni, like, but so they were in the air, or better, in the water somewhere, arriving from. But it's still like it's not even properly the Western Frankish warfare has fully developed its own potential. So you can imagine in this more fragmented reality, it was really about still also the individuality and the push and the drive that cared, that mattered. That mattered a lot. Sometimes, in fact, we find the Normans mostly outnumbered very often, right? They say they achieved these victories in southern Italy against the odds, right? But it has to do properly with the fact that of infantries, especially in the Byzantine influenced areas, that could be another cliche, by the way, and that it also in the Muslim held areas, but objectively, like in the broader Frankish Central European reality, you find also think about the incipient communal infantries in the north of the Italian peninsula, to find more robust infantries sort that actually, and we will see it now, in southern Italy do not seem in most areas to be in fact that soft, right? But as far as the involvement of, for example, this local Byzantine militias against Normans, these guys didn't even want to fight them. As we've seen, mostly they also wanted to actually to crush the Byzantine rule that was somewhat oppressing them. So it's really all to see. I repeat, I've seen a lot of controversial, a lot of somewhat even opposed opinions relative to this. Other aspect is the famous kite-shaped shield, right, of the Normans. That it is developed in the Norman reality as well, but seemingly in the Byzantine reality too, and there is evidence that this may have even actually predated what happened in Normandy, right? Also, this is a type of shield that starts developing a bit in the other areas, not just among Normans specifically. So it's complicated even in there to point out that is a Norman thing. No, it doesn't seem to be, right? Also the use of crossbow, in which the Normans will become very skilled. The myth that knights didn't use crossbows is absolutely false. They did, and especially at this time, the Normans will become great employers of not just of crossbowmen, properly how to operate the thing themselves. And the southern Normans were dramatically open, right? And it does turn out that, in fact, crossbows were present already in this southern area, together with a lot of other things that the Normans seem to have properly gotten from these areas, right? To create their original synthesis, to improve their equipment, to become something that, objectively, and I repeat it, if you look at the Iberian Peninsula, we can guess properly was more advanced in these areas of the south, of the western and central Mediterranean, that have been brutally overlooked, and that weren't even properly connected to there, because they received these influences via the Muslim channel, especially up to Central Asia, right? So with all, naturally, it seems actually that the Muslim armies of southern Italy were much more similar to the Egyptian ones, for example, than the Turkish or Persian ones. That is to say, their infantries were usually stronger, right? But when they're faced with Norman cavalry, they're wiped out. So whatever the reason may be, has to do, in my opinion, with the fact that even Muslim Sicily was torn apart by factionalism. We know that it was mostly in the northwest that the state controlled something. The rest were all these scattered small landlords, right? The Muslims, when they invaded Sicily, they didn't retain the Byzantine latifundium. They basically split the land among all the various conquerors. So, as a consequence, there wasn't anything like what was happening in northern France, for example, where you could have this dramatically trained and equipped knights, because they had this overwhelming amount of land and lots of people working for them. Now, it was a much more egalitarian thing, so the Normans take a lot to conquer Sicily, but they don't find any dramatic concentration of forces to meet with them. And we know, in fact, this, difficulty as it is, like in most heavier armies do in contexts of guerrilla, and they can't find the enemy, right? They expend all these resources in sieges and in preventing ambushes. The infantries are pretty damn important in there too, right? But still, at least the sources insist that the resolutive main was cavalry, and that even when they were outnumbered, the problem is this fundamentally, that there were situations which the Normans were so outnumbered they even dismounted and fought alongside the infantry, right? Which was typical in many ways, even in other, in England, as we've seen Normandy proper. But they had really to be very outnumbered. Like with the Seljuks at Dyrrhachium, the thing was very much like what would happen in the Crusades, for example, where the guys needed sometimes to dismount. To be better protected, to protect the horses especially, right? We're talking about the same years of the Crusades, because we're talking about the 80s of the 11th century. It's just 10 years later. They're the same people, right? But as far as this kind of, more, like foot militias, etc., of the Byzantine-held areas of Muslim Sicily were concerned for, at that point, the advantage they have is if you don't attack them with cavalry, right? Because cavalry by definition cannot defend unless it dismounts. But at that point you lose all the potential you have of launching that dramatic charge that is way more effective than just you on foot. In fact, this is something that Anna Komnena writes, that said when these Normans remained on foot, they could be easily taken. And this is what the Muslims say actually about the Crusaders as well, right? So it was a need in many ways to countercharge, right? Especially when the thing was resolved by melee, right? Instead, against horse archery, objectively, it was not a bad move to dismount, because horse archery can be fenced off also by kind of a medium infantry, right? This is what we see countless times in the Crusades, where, especially when the Crusaders met with the Turks, that had a very narrow, heavy cavalry elite, numerically speaking, and the rest were swarms of horse archers that, they're painted behind with all the constant showering of arrows, but it's not that they count to grip with you; they have much of a chance, right? So charging, this aggressive mindedness that allows the Normans to take over this region. This is stressed, but this is very important, because you understand it's actually, it makes sense as an explanation. Also in Clausewitzian times, it's about their force, their moral force, that makes the difference. Passing to closer evidence, which is not present in great number in this area, as we were saying before, unfortunately. There is an exultate roll that is also typical of certain areas of southern Italy, showing the crucifixion, dated between the 10th and the 11th century. And in here we see a man that wields a spear with obvious wings or flanges beneath its blade. And he also carries what it seems to be a straight sword with a single, slightly curved edge, right? And such a weapon is held also by another figure, and it probably reflects Byzantine or even Islamic Sicilian or North African influence in this context. And both weapons have a simple nut-shaped pommels. This equipment is fascinating, because it shows a type of weapon that has mostly a cutting role, as you understand, a cutting design, functionally speaking. This could be because of the relatively lighter armored context in which these realities were, right? It's typical most of the Byzantine eras or the Islamic eras to be slightly less armored overall in terms of numbers, right? The Byzantines at this point were masters of military technology, as we've seen. Even the kite-shaped shield associated to Normans may have been actually an influence of the Romaioi on the Rush, also on the Russian mercenaries and so on. But quantitatively speaking, they're lighter. So this idea of cutting through a guy that has less armor, that we find a cutting weapon mostly, it's because you see the possibility of doing it, especially when the rest of the equipment is pretty light. And this also involves a very dynamic fencing, right? Because if you, that's not a spear, we see a spear, but also the possibility of closing in. And if you're not dramatically armored, that means that you have to be pretty damn quick, right, to come the short distance of this enemies. There is also the arrest of Jesus from a carved relief in Apulia in the mid-11th century in Monte Sant'Angelo, in situ in the tomb of Rotary. And there is a man armed only with a spear that shows unequivocal Byzantine and Islamic influence, right? In both costume and style of carving. We're talking about Apulia. So, there were certainly Bari and Taranto at some point were emirates, right? There was this ephemeral, previously in previous centuries had been this ephemeral Islamic rule, right? But here we're talking about contexts that could easily be Norman already, right? This is what you have to understand. Here it's not to say, these guys are, Byzantine or Islamic, so it's not Norman. No, that's not the point. The Normans would have been equipped exactly in the same way sometimes, right? Because you change that. You don't fight just in a single way, and there is not just the heavily armored knight. There's plenty of other guys with them, already from wherever they came from. This is important to stress, and you don't go anywhere without that, right? A knight cannot work if he doesn't have someone who helps him. Then we have other things like headgears, like turbans, for example, are types of helmets that are associated to this broader kind of Eastern fashion. That also in terms of equipment, of also certain lighter clothing, fresher clothing in a way. Central Mediterranean is pretty tough in summer, so consider even we see it even among the Crusaders in the Near East. They had sometimes to not to be fully equipped because they couldn't take it. They could simply die of exhaustion, of a sun, over exposure to sun. It was frankly very common in many contexts at that point. And sometimes it's even better to be lighter, to run, for example, than to be so heavy and being captured in certain contexts. Then we find a carved altar in Campania from the late 11th to 12th century. This is the Church of St. Mary in Valle Porclaneta in Magliano de Mars in Italy. And there are interesting weapons in here depicted. One is a recurved bow with angled ears. It was very common through the central and eastern Mediterranean, right? The winged or flanged mace, right? There's almost certainly of Islamic, at least influence, however. It might have been introduced via, for example, the nearby seaport and major trading center of Amalfi, right? Or other, think about guys that's maintained habitually, traded habitually with Muslims. But of course, it was a Christian power. This combination, curved bow and mace, is like, you could say, these are Seljuk, right? I'm not kidding. There's a Middle Eastern influence here we find, and in Campania, by the way, not in Sicily, right? So in an area that was fundamentally, Western and almost Francicized over time. Because, by the way, we didn't see in all this, there were also imperial expeditions for the Holy Roman Empire repeatedly in these areas. They often interplayed. The Norman influence brings this Frankish influence as well. So it's still the point that though all those weapons were used, and by the way, why couldn't a Norman warrior have a flanged mace, especially fighting against armored opponents? That's what you really want to have and what you can use, because a mace is short. You have to be very well protected to arrive to the enemy. So why not? And why not even a bow in the first place? This stuff might have been, ideally, if we have seen it transposed into a real person, it might have been also the gear of a Norman knight. we have another carved relief from late 11th century Apulia in the church of Saint Bernadetto in Brindisi. Here it's just, I mean, geographically, I don't know, it's in the Strait of Otranto. It's just thus facing Albania, the Byzantine Empire, right? So, and this is taken from a frieze representing huntsmen in what's to seem actually the most Islamic influence of 11th century southern Italian carvings, right? That's not Western Sicily, as is closest place to Tunisia. This is the closest place to the Balkans, but you find the single most influenced Islamic influence in this representation. So think about it. One man not only has a tall helmet, but also wears a probable nasal, right? This was important in the broader development of properly also facial protections, which the Normans will be, especially the one of southern Italy, be associated with certain important development of the coif de camaille and so on. And he also wields a broad-bladed spear, which has an apparent bamboo haft. Right? Think about it. He seemed to wear a padded or kilted coat or tunic, and they seem to be all stylicized by this strongly Islamic and more particularly North African influence. Other figures have short spears, one with wings of phalanges, right, which is also something you find, as we'll see better now, in Islamic area too. And they also have this kind of padded armor as well. Then we have a crucifixion from an ivory plaque from southern Italy, the 11th century. This is preserved at the Staatliche Museum in Berlin. And these are very interesting because now we will look at the famous ivory chessmen that we are mostly pointed at also for looking out. These are Normans, look at them. Even when you will have this Anglo-Norman books that they often say, oh, look at these are Normans, but might actually not be. And this is to compare with this crucifixion, in which figures a typically European figure that has, however, a short spear, short tunic, cross-gartered legs, that can be seen, in fact, throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and even in the Islamic regions beyond. Right, and there is a strong similarity with the local peasant costume during the 11th century. But that, however, is also to be extended to other areas of Europe, telling the truth. Also, the peasantry in Europe mostly wore the same thing, but here it's associated with certain equipment that is Eastern. So this is a fully Western figure. Even just by style, you can easily see it. But it shows this also specific Eastern Mediterranean or even Islamic characters. Passing to the ivory chessmen from southern Italy or Sicily, we don't know. Dated to the 11th century. This is from the National Bibliothèque, I think the Cabinet of the Medals in Paris, France. And they are four, if I'm not wrong. In fact, and they are the most important single source of information about 11th century southern Italian military equipment as a whole. Right. This is, I don't remember which book I was reading the other day, which showed this from the Anglo-Normans. Said, look at them. It's actually a southern Italian thing, broadly meant, so it could be properly of all these various cultures at the same time. So also it portrays the traditional styles of equipment used in the Longobards duchies, the Byzantine provinces, or even Islamic Sicily. Right? They can be that all. Right? Because, it's not that Western Franks invented their own equipment. It's something that was somewhat more widespread all around. It was just functionalized for a specific use, but hey, that use existed also elsewhere, right? It's not that these other guys didn't have heavy cavalry or collective training or weren't heavily armored. So these guys may be Longobards, Byzantines, Sicilians, all over this time. And technically, in fact, they may not have much in common with the Norman newcomers specifically. In fact, especially the type of fashion displayed in this chessmen has little in common with 11th century Northern Europe, but a great deal instead in common with the Byzantine Empire and especially Western Islam, so including even up to Spain. And the fact that, for example, one horseman carries a kite-shaped shield, as we have seen before, in no way indicates Norman influence. Right? These shields were widely used and may have been developed in Constantinople themselves. This first guy also wears what seems to be a pointed hood, which goes right around his head and chin, right, to kind of extend that protection. There weren't that. This is not like an all-enveloping helmet, because at this time they didn't exist. So it either represents a mail coif or a fabric-covered hood as well, or a hat even worn over a small helmet of sorts. There were all these types of combinations easily. This kind of gear is not surprisingly seen in earlier Islamic areas and even in parts of Central Asia, bordering the Islamic world. And it might have been also actually an Italian response to some Byzantine equipment, right? And therefore, it's even more intriguing. The horseman also seems to hold this broad, non-tapering sword of early medieval Mediterranean form, albeit he has no scabbard. He has what seems to be a sleeveless cuirass or hauberk that reaches down to his waist. And the style in which it is represented doesn't allow us to understand whether it's mail or lamellar armor. Albeit it seems the latter to be more likely. As you know, lamellar cuirasses were pretty much in use in Byzantine armor at this time, and they were actually way more widespread when we think, but they have this kind of more typical Eastern origin. But we find them employed by the Vikings, by the Anglo-Saxons, in everywhere, actually. Just, we know that it was most typically coming from the East and closer to Italy, in this case, the Byzantine Empire, which had a pretty, as we've seen, pretty damn advanced armoring production at this point. Also, looking at the other two horsemen, these carry instead a round shield. So it's very fascinating that these chessmen are depicted with having different forms of shield. They're not uniform, and it shows what is actually confirmed by other sources about the coexistence, naturally, of the kite shape and the round one. And to be more specific, actually, when we think of a kite-shaped shield, we don't have to think it's something so alternative compared to the round shield, because actually a kite-shaped shield evolves from the round-shaped shield, right? The round part of the top is actually still the round shape, and it's just from at the bottom that develops this point fundamentally to cover the legs, right? And but it's not even here something specifically distinctive, and it would be different reasons why you want to use it or not at the same time, right? Just think about the stirrup as well, right? On the Bahia tapestry, still not everybody has the stirrup here, right? That's because still the collective training, the feudalism is still in theory, it's still being processed, and not everybody still needs to wear stirrup, because a good horseman can do without, and also simply, the functionalization for a heavier impact may not be so regularly employed yet right? It's a bit of a mechanicistic, even organistic idea, but the idea is that they, of course, did both things at the same time. Among the various length grips, you can enumerate even the double hand one. Here it's all mixed, and we can only state that it's going towards one direction specifically. So these guys have round shields, broad swords in their right hand, and a scabbard over their left hip. Actually, I think this is only one of the horsemen. Sorry. So he is wearing an hauberk as well. No sword belt is visible. The hauberk includes a coif with it, and its surface patterning looks, however, lamellar. And lamellar cuirass and lamellar aventail are not unconceivable. Just they are unlikely by the 11th century Mediterranean. Right, it could be a crude representation of an ordinary male hauberk. Right, could have been like that, but still, art doesn't render us perfectly what this was meant to be. The second guy also wears a low domed helmet, perhaps fluted, with a separate rim and a curved lower edge, giving, let's say, more like an outline that is different from a normal European helmet. And what is interesting here, we've seen it also in the video on the 13th century Spanish knight, is that this type of helmet has similarities with a much later bassinet that may indicate that the bassinet may have actually been originated not only in the Mediterranean, but more specifically in the Byzantine or Islamic regions. There is a substantial amount of Iberian evidence for this, also for later, better documented times. If you look at that video, you will find that. Now, there is a foot soldier too, that is even more unusual. He has a slightly pointed helmet with a nozzle. He appears to be wearing over the sides and back of his head, in common with the previous figure, this proto-bassinet. Right? And the lower rim seems to indicate that a male is attached properly to it. So this could be like an aventail, right? Although a helmet worn over a male coif and hauberk seems also more likely by this date. But we simply don't know in this case what it meant to represent. Also, he seems to wear basically this short-sleeved male hauberk, with comes to his waist, but also has a flap down the front. This is worn over a sash, right, which is very much similar to certain Sicilian or Middle Eastern figures. And his sword is also of the broad Mediterranean form. His shield is very tall, kite-shaped mantlet, perhaps with a flattened base in other areas of Italy or the Middle East. We have other figures like the centaur for carved elephant of Campania of the 11th century. This is at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And it's meant to come from Salerno. And here there is a mace that, albeit crudely portrayed, kind of matches with the presence of such weapons in 11th century southern Italy, as we've seen after Byzantine or Islamic influence. Because, by the way, this thing, as we remember before, the bow and the mace, that's typical also of the steppe in many ways. So it's not just Islam meant as, it could be, forget about the Seljuks that had come out of Central Asia in many ways. So this stuff could come, say, from even Kazakhstan, right, or the Pontic steppe, broadly meant, via Constantinople, which is another option. We have a carved elephant, also from the Chartreuse de Porte in Campania, mid-11th century. This is essentially a carved task of Saracenic workmanship, right? This is kind of typical also in later times. In Sicily under Norman times, there worked a lot of Muslim artisans as well, or at least some of were pretty skilled in the same art, the same styles. But and this was probably made in Amalfi, in fact, and so it could be produced just by local Italians, not necessarily just being influenced by such forms. There is even here in the cloth more than else, a typical 12th century Middle Eastern influence that is observable, in fact, also in the Palatine Chapel in Sicily, built by the Normans. Other Middle Eastern influence. Then we have the Leges from the Leges Langobardorum, so from the archives of the Badia della Santissima Trinita in Cava, Italy, 11th century Campania, which also shows the considerable Islamic influence seen in other parts of pre-Norman southern Italy. The guy seems to wear a tiraz band around the arm of his tunic. He has also a broad yet slightly tapering sword that is pretty much similar to others in the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond, that could arrive even up to Indian art, right, through the Arab world. In fact, the Arabs imported the highly prized Saif al-Hind, or Indian sword. What we're talking about. The Indians also developed the Vots thing. They had this way to insufflate a lot of air in these furnaces, so reaching higher temperatures, thanks to the monsoons. The stuff. They had pretty damn good swords at the time. And the guy also has this small, round or oval shield, patterns of multiple rivets holding the internal straps. It's also very similar to some North African or Andalusian shields compared to northern Italy or the rest of Europe, for that matter. We have another carved elephant from southern Italy or Sicily in the late 11th century. This stays now at the private collection on loan to Victoria and Albert Museum in London. We have a problem because we have a 17th century silver mount that obscures the upper part of the ivory figure represented here. But there are some features that are clearly visible and that also indicate Islamic inspiration, at least. For example, short-sleeved, probably male shirt, which is likely to continue inside his waist sash and skirt. And he also holds this deeply convex shield in his fist and wields a sword without guillon, right? Which suggests, in my opinion, possibility of also here a close combat, right? Something connected to sort of individual combat, let's say. This is also typical of Sicily and North Africa at this point. We have also the guard at the Holy Sepulchre from an exulted roll from Monte Cassino in the 11th century Campania, let's say, the borderline with the Papal States inside it. And this stays at the Cathedral Archives of Capua in Italy. The figure is somewhat damaged and also confused in drawing proper. Yet we can see a soldier in it with a hauberk and an oval or inverted kite-shaped shield and a conical helmet. Right. There's another weapon that may actually be an axe, and you understand immediately that this combination is much more Western European than else, right? This is what also we presume it makes it dated to perhaps the late 11th century. We have from the Encyclopedia of Maurus Rabanus, here made in Campania 1023, we are lucky to date it precisely, so it's fairly early in time. This stays at the Abbey Library, manuscript 132, Monte Cassino. And this shows this is somewhat overlooked source, first of all, and it shows what we could think could be the traditional arms and armor in pre-Norman southern Italy. Shields are round or oval and deeply convex, which is interesting because it's not just protective, but it could also properly stress an individual, an individualized combat in some ways. Male hauberks are short-sleeved and slit at the sides or front, and are without coif, at least apparently. One may have a crudely drawn ventaille. Helmets are more stilized in a strange way. They have rings on top. Three may have either male coif or certain types of Byzantine or Turco-Iranian style hoods or caps worn over possible helmets, so it's a bit complicated, but it wouldn't be a strange combination after all. Other helmets are basically just classicistic imitations in some ways, like, this what they thought the Middle Ages the Romans wore. You find it even in Carolingian manuscript, the types that are not eventually to be confirmed by archaeology otherwise. One of them is conical and without coif. Another seems to be of two-piece construction, is two half domes, that is seen in elsewhere in early medieval southern Europe. There are spears, with or without wings or flanges, plus a probable javelin as well, which is also interesting and not at all uncommon, as we've seen also for what the Norman warfare was concerned. There are many different spears to be observed, but whatever. Swords are all of the broad early medieval Mediterranean form, with normally with short straight quillons. They have curved round and typical early medieval European trefoil pommels. There is also a bow and an arrow that appear randomly. Daggers are very interesting. One work knife is shown with having curved blade. Others have tapering, almost triangular blades. Another has a rounded tip and a tear-shaped pommel. The others look very much southern Italian, or perhaps, or more accurately, central Mediterranean, right, coming also from Tunisia. And prototypes of the later Basilard. They also have bar-like pommels, right, that makes them almost H-shaped in the hilt, very distinctive. So this could actually be, even in interest of time, like a 2.5 centuries in advance Basilard. Right. We have a depiction of the pharaoh's army from an exulted roll of 11th century Campania that is in the Cathedral Archives, Roll 2 in Gaeta, Italy. This was made in Gaeta, right? It was up there in the north. It was basically the last of the duchies. These principalities had, fundamentally emancipated from the Byzantine rule, pretty close to Papal area. And this rose, in fact, shows supposedly a more typical European-styled trooper. Right, the pharaoh's army is drawing in the Red Sea, and there is at this point you would think let's stilize them as Saracens. Instead, not. They are stylized as the enemies, right? And the two horsemen depicted wear a full male hauberk with long, close-fitting sleeves. And this latter feature especially was not normal in Western Europe until well into the 12th century. So it either indicates that southern Italy was technologically more advanced than the north, or that such hauberks were associated with the enemy, perhaps Islamic or Byzantine, but in practice it means that still these forms of armor were around there anyway. So both riders also carry spears and wear round helmets of two-piece construction riveted to a central comb with a band around the rim. Also another has a large round shield. Then we can see this other exalted role in southern Italy. 11th century. This is preserved in the Civic Museum in Pisa. And this was dedicated to a duke and an emperor. And it was made in an area within, or at least associated with the empire, yet, however, also in the South Italian cultural zone. So this could easily be where the exalted roles were used. So it could be, for example, the Duchy of Spoleto that we remembered before. It was this, was properly an imperial fief, or even the Duchy of Benevent, which fell under papal control during the 11th century, as we've seen. So it's kind of fitting for broader Western influence, or at least the reach also of the Holy Roman Imperial authority in the area. And there is the picture is a bit crudely drawn, but it reminds vaguely Byzantine art, generally speaking. There's a main figure with a small round shield and a spear with wings below the blade, right? And there is another identical spear somewhere else. So he also seems to wear a hood or coif, right? Perhaps the former, judging from the floppy headgear of a second figure. The cloak is also similar to Southern Italian models. They have some former sleeveless armor in the upper body of their bodies, and the construction is not clear, but they seem to be like a small lamellar cuirass that is to be found sometimes in worn even over other armors in other cases, but still used at the time, even alone. We have the figure of the centurion at the crucifixion from the exalted roll from Monte Cassino, dated around 1075. This is at British Library now. And the style of this exalted is almost entirely traditional Byzantine, right? The military equipment illustrated alike. There may be some archaism in it, but let's say that there is, it's in line with also the current Byzantine weaponry, fundamentally. So that shows also how far the Byzantine influence. I mean, how far? It was relatively next door, but still in a different area. Well, the papacy this time was actually very influenced by the Byzantine world as well. So it's fitting, perfectly fitting. We have from a manuscript of Monte Cassino dated to 1070 a figure of Saint Benedict that frees a prisoner. This stays at the Vatican Library, Latin manuscript 1202, folio 72, naturally in Rome. And all the details of the rider's equipment here and the horse harness point instead here to a strong northern influence. At this point, almost surely a consequence of the penetration and domination of the Normans in southern Italy. The cavalryman carries a large kite-shaped shield, right, slung across his back on a guige, right? It was typical also for example, employing weapons in both hands. In fact, it has a strong lance without wings or flanges, like a kind of a big contus could be, but perhaps not a specific picture. And his saddle is of the tall type, with raised cantle and pommel, right, associated with the couche style lance blade. Another depiction of the pharaoh's army from an exalted roll from Monte Cassino dated 1075. This is British Library too. And here we have short-sleeved lamellar cuirasses that are probably conventional equipment. They may be of Byzantine influence actually. The helmet is conical. Some have nasals and decorative plumes or feathers, which we rarely remember of, generally speaking, in the broader appearance of these guys. There are background figures with coifs or avantiles as well. rich of which cover also the lower part of the wearer's face. So this is including. This is interesting because the Norman equipment, normal helmets and avental and coifs are mostly sometimes thought evolving towards closing the face. This is a bit old. It happens in Western warfare, for many reasons connected properly to both the developing of the more precise couché lance pointing at the enemy's cavalry face, but also because of, let's not underestimate it here, missile force arriving, especially in the Mediterranean, fighting against the more likely keep troops from the Muslim Byzantine area, and that were pretty good at showering with arrows, as we have seen. There is one spear with a typically Western European gonfalon shown, also with both large and round once again kite-shaped shields appearing. The saddles seems also to be of the Western European type, with raised cantle and pommel. And this is pretty much it. So you understand it's not a dramatic evidence, but it's still realizing, and here we were towards the end of the period, right, of the end of the 11th century, but that the context from which the Normans emerge here and also stay for all this time is dramatically influenced by a lot of other military cultures, and that these actually this evidence could represent also somewhat typically, say not typically, but possibly Norman equipment at the same time. So if we were to stereotype with the typical Italo-Norman heavy cavalryman, at this time we would look at the 11th century South Italian chess pieces that we have seen before, with this lamellar corselet that betrays Byzantine influence, as Normans fought and you can say first encountered the Byzantines, of course, in Italy, but as far as from the west, the Normandy perspective was concerned, in part, but people traveled far and wide, as we've seen, so it's somewhat even incorrect to conceptualize it in this way. But they fought like hell against the Byzantines in that context, whereas the first Varangians actually just fought against the Byzantines in early time, but eventually came just to enter their own army, right? So fighting in an army or against an army is also considering that the surrounding armies are somewhat similar, so it's all asynchronous. It's a bit the same thing, but still, here we have a distinctive local power that rises, also fighting against the Byzantines, right? And as we've seen, the Normans were fighting as mercenaries for Apulian rebels from the first tenth of or the second tenth of the 11th century, right? And this is pretty much it. And if we were to look at what an average Longbird horse heavy cavalryman would be, but as we were saying before, it could be literally identical to a Norman knight, because why not, right? We don't see from the evidence we have the same picture in many ways. It could be typically ash spear, 8-9 feet long, used in the most different ways that were kept being used all the time. They pretty much similar to the same Norman cavalry of William the Conqueror, right? We know of this hauberk being pretty clear in imagination to the Byzantines, for example, where it says that it was fully capable of resisting arrows, for example, making the wearer almost, if not completely invulnerable, according to her. Aside from the fact that eventually she talks about crossbows and how it could pierce this thing. So it's also, and she is referring chiefly to the Turkish arrows in that sense, where we find these variations as well, but the conical helmet with nozzle, etc. We wouldn't think, in this sense, a Norman knight or a Longbird knight in look could be different. Were the same. They were hired by the same people who gave them money to buy even just the stuff they fought with locally, right? They bought the local stuff. They produced their own stuff. So this is particularly important. Also, if we were to talk about the bulk of Italian troops fighting alongside, were like citizen militiamen, right? The best equipped would have been, you know, just like the French and German types we will analyze at some point, crossbowmen that were used there too, right? And possibly even earlier than in the north. And maybe we will see those prototypes on another occasion, but it's not that there's much typization or conceptualization of Lombard troops at this time, because objectively they're mostly connected to the rise of the Normans. If you document them, they're essentially the same Lombards. And also, as we've seen, this allegedly typically Norman equipment could be used even before the Norman conquest in the same Islamic system, right? So that's pretty much it. And we will make videos about all the stuff we have mentioned, and it's almost embarrassing that we haven't even started to properly talk about these areas, right? We're beginning just now in a very singular way, because this is probably the very first video about this specific context of the rise of the Normans in southern Italy. But we will continue. We'll continue about the Norman conquest of Sicily. We'll talk about the Norman expansion also against the Byzantine Empire, the Crusades, the consolidation of the kingdom. We will talk also of, naturally, the rest of Norman warfare. I think this is perhaps the first video, which just seems kind of incredible, 8 out of 800 videos, mostly dedicated to the Middle Ages. We talk about the Normans. As such, I mean the ones deriving from the Duchy of Normandy, specifically, as we talk actually extensively at this point about Scandinavian warfare, right? That is naturally connected to this as well, but always remembering that these troops were ultra composed, and that most of the actually the Norman armies in this context were southern Italy in many ways. So. Alright, for now we stop it here, and I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.